Hi there, thanks for joining us again. This is our Pastor's Corner teaching series on the book of James. These are broken down into small segments that you can watch all together, or you can take them at your own pace as we go through section by section, verse by verse, chapter by chapter. Today we're looking at James chapter 1, verses 13 to 18. James chapter 1, verses 13 to 18. Here's what it says. When tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. Then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is fully grown, gives birth to death. Don't be deceived, my dear brothers and sisters. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. He chose to give us birth through the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits of all he created. So if you've been looking at these passages of James, the first part of chapter 1, James has been talking about the idea of trials. And trials lead to testing. Testing leads to faith. Faith leads to our spiritual maturity, or to become more like Jesus. James now introduces a different word. He introduces the word temptation at this point. Now, temptation is different from a trial. And we're going to find today that temptation leads us in a different path. And so here's how it's going to look. The Greek word for trial and temptation is a very similar root Greek word, but the idea of trials is more like a noun, but the idea of temptation is more like a verb. So trials are usually the things that I experience in life, and temptation is my response to those experiences. Last time we looked at an example that James gave us of a financial trial. Maybe you're going through a financial trial. That again is the trial, having difficulty making ends meet. The temptation is I may steal something from Walmart because I just don't have the finances to get it. And that's the temptation part. So every trial gives us two paths. Each trial gives us two paths. Trials can lead to testing, testing leading to faithfulness, faithfulness leading to spiritual maturity. As we look at this one, James is going to introduce this route. Trials can lead to temptation. Temptation can lead to sin. Sin can lead to death. So James wants us to examine how the other route, how we can go down this other route, but it's a warning for us not to take this route. So one of our temptations then is, when we look at this passage, is he starts off in verse 13. He says, when tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me. So here's the ultimate thing. When we're tempted, the first thing we want to do is we want to blame someone else. We want to blame someone else. This is not new. In Genesis 3, when Adam and Eve first sinned, the first thing they did was they started blaming each other. Adam blamed Eve. Eve blamed the snake, the serpent. And so Adam even blamed God as well. And so one of the things that we find that when we're in the middle of our trials is that we tend to blame God for what is happening. We blame God and we say, God is tempting me. And now here's the thing. God cannot do that. God cannot do that. He does not tempt us to fall into sin. God is perfect. He doesn't tempt us. He cannot tempt us. God is good. We have this expression in Christianity. God is good all the time. God is never behind any of our temptations. God allows trials to mature us, but they are not intended for us to go into sin. And so what leads us into temptation? Well, he says in verse 14, it's our own evil desires. It's our own evil desires. Each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desires and enticed. So who's responsible for my sin? Who's responsible for my sin choices? Me. Me and me alone. We even like to blame others. We like to say, well, you're the reason why I got angry. You're the reason why I lost my temper. You're the reason why I did this action. We even blame Satan. Satan, you're the reason why I sinned. The reality is we all have a sin nature. We were born that way. We all have this sin nature. And so the only person who is responsible for our sin is ourselves. So why do I fail when I'm tempted? Well, here's the thing. We have a tendency then to press our luck. We think that I'm good, I'm strong enough. And so when sinful desires come into our lives, we kind of play with it. We kind of toy with it in our minds for a bit. And it soon breeds into something else. And so it's sometimes like I would say with pornography, like we maybe just a little bit, I'm not going to fall to that temptation, and we just start exposing ourselves to something just a little bit, and before we know it, we've fallen too far away. Sometimes I'm tempted because I've lost my understanding of my meaning or purpose or value, and I try to replace it with something else. And so we do that when we pursue things like money, or when we pursue things like academics. Like many of our students, sometimes we're pursuing academics so hard that we stop going to church and attending church. We stop reading our Bibles. We stop our relationship with God. Or maybe we just, because we're looking to accomplish something, we turn away from God and we put all our mind and energy into that thing that we're trying to accomplish. And so we end up falling away from God or walking away from God. That's what happens when we get tempted. And so in verse 15, James is continuing to remind us of this path, this simple formula: desire, which leads to sin, and sin, which leads to death. For those of you who are Star Wars fans out there, it's like when Yoda was talking to Anakin Skywalker, he says, fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, hate leads to suffering. And that's the formula that he's using. Well, here the formula is this. James is saying there's two ways we can do this. Our trials can lead to testing. Our testing can lead to faith. Our faith can lead us to spiritual maturity. And that's the positive route, if you want to take. That's the positive route to take. But there's the other route. Trial can lead to temptation. Temptation can lead to sin. And sin can lead to death. What is this idea of death? Again, this idea of death is that sin leads us away from our relationship with God. And without that relationship with God, we lose value, we lose dignity, we lose purpose, we lose meaning. Ultimately, that relationship is separated, and it leads to death. But God didn't leave us in that. He gave us life, that if we would pursue Him, we would find life, and we would find life to the full. So what are we supposed to do with this? Well, we have a choice to make. Whenever a trial comes up, we have a choice to make. We can follow the trial to testing to faith, faith to spiritual maturity, or we can follow the trial to temptation to sin, and sin to death. Again, the choice is ours. The choice is ours to make, and the responsibility of that choice is ultimately ours. So we need to accept responsibility for our own actions, our own thoughts, our own desires. We can't blame others for the circumstances or the consequences of our sin choices. But here's the reality. God does not leave us in our sin choices. He has always given us a way out through Jesus. So our call is to do our best to avoid sin and don't let it linger. Don't let it fester. Don't let things like greed or hate or anger or jealousy or lust, don't let these things linger in our life. Don't let them linger. And then James ends off this section by simply reminding us that God is good. He talks about the idea, don't be fooled, my dear brothers and sisters. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming from God. Remember that God is good. Hold on to that truth whenever you're going through a trial. Hold on to this one simple truth that God is good. He's faithful in all that He does. He says every good and perfect gift comes from the Father of lights. It's a great term. It's one that's unique here. No one really mentions Father of lights except for James. And as he mentions it, he's talking about who's the creator of light. Who created light? In Genesis 1:1, out of darkness God created light. Who created the sun, moon, and stars? And he's comparing God, giving a metaphor for God, who is this constant, like the sun, moon, and stars are constant. God is this constant. He doesn't change. He's always going to do good, and He never changes. And so the faithfulness of God is something that we can count on always. And then he uses this language in verse 18, the first fruits language. He says that we might be a kind of first fruits of all He created. The amazing thing is that you and I, as humankind, we are the first thing that God redeemed through Jesus. We are the first thing that God redeemed through Jesus. That's an amazing thought. When Jesus died on the cross and rose again, that relationship with God that we had could be restored. And we are the first to experience that. The Bible tells us that God is going to make all things new. God's going to recreate the earth, nature, and all the things that are all wrong, that is not supposed to be this way. God's going to redo it all. But we are the first ones to experience it. Humankind is the first ones who ultimately get to experience what it means to be made new. So what to do with that? If you can, take time this week to honor God because He is good. Claim that truth, believe in that truth, write it down, put it on your doorpost, put it somewhere. Just remind that of yourself all the time, that God is good. And when you face trials, I want to encourage you, keep it in the back of your head that God is indeed good. It's hard, but it's possible. So the encouragement for you, if you go through a trial to testing to faith, faith to spiritual maturity, Don't go the other way, where trial is to temptation, temptation to sin, sin to death. Hold on to the fact that God is good. Thanks for joining us this time. We'll see you again on our next Pastor's Corner.